Welcome back to my series on hydropower in British Columbia. In particular, my focus thus far has been outlining the benefits of the current Site C project and the history of hydroelectric dam construction in BC. Click here for part 1, or click down here for part 2, or follow the links below. Now today, you'll see me talk to local opponents of the project as well as some proponents. And as with most projects, the opponents are usually the most vocal. I spoke with two of the most public opponents of the Site C project. Until recently, protesters had set up a makeshift camp near the site. That was until BC Hydro won a court order dismantling the camp. One member of that camp was Helen Knott, a Treaty 8 member and a social worker in Fort St. John. I asked her why she's so opposed to this project.
What had inspired me to take a stand was that this is home and this is where I want to raise my son. You know, I know people have been here for generations, and we love this area. I was living down south in Kelowna when they did the approval. I think it was in December 2014, and that's when I knew it was time to come back home as well. So we moved home for this. You know, when I was in Toronto, somebody was asking, well, tell me about the energy crisis in BC. And I was like, well, what energy crisis in BC currently? So if you look at that, you know, a lot of the things just don't add up. And with the skip over by the BC UC or the Utilities Commission and not going under review like it should have, you think, like, as a ratepayer, is that in your best interest? And for me, because I'm a social worker as well, I look at the families that I work with that are already struggling to make ends meet. And with that 28% hike over the next few years that's supposed to come, you know, I know that people are going to be choosing between lights or food. My father is pro, like, industry, pro, I will work at the dam if I need to. And I think it's been created that way over a long period of time to do the conquer and divide. So I see it as a tool of colonialism. Just like the building of the W.A.C. Bennett Dam, the Site C dam will require a reservoir, and that means some land will be flooded. While the size of the Site C reservoir will be much smaller than Williston Lake, it will still flood properties belonging to local landowners, and some is agricultural land. One of those local landowners is Ken Boone. I headed out to his property to talk with him. We're on your property right now here, and this has been a property that's been in your wife's family for a couple generations. And we're looking out here over on the Peace River, and this is basically where we're standing now. It's kind of where the water line would come up to if the dam was built.
Yeah, just below us, just behind me would be the high water mark.
And you would stand to lose a lot of farmland, wouldn't you?
Yeah, basically all our farmland, you know, all our own deeded farmland and the best farmland that we farm would all be lost.
Why do you think this project is a mistake?
Well, you name it, it's a mistake. You know, from economic basis, there's no business case for this project. That's been clearly articulated by energy experts such as Robert McCulloch and others. Just recently in the affidavits that we filed in court for the injunction that Hydro sought. You know, there is no business case for this project in the year 2016. This is the old way of doing things. The smart money is not on building mega projects anymore, hoping for a huge market for export or whatever for your sales. You know, so that's been demonstrated. You know, I mean, obviously agriculture reasons, loss of farmland in light of climate change. You know, we're flooding a low elevation river valley in the north with its own microclimate where we can grow cantaloupe and corn and you name it. You know, in this day and age, that is incredibly stupid. You know, and then of course there's the human side of it. You know, the Treaty 8 rights. You know, this is a blatant infringement of Treaty 8 rights. And that has not been fully addressed yet. And the frustrating thing is we don't need to do this anymore. You know, in the past we had no choice possibly, but we're well beyond those days. You know, there is no need to be doing this anymore. We can be building small, clean and green generation as we need it incrementally and where we need it.
Solar and wind in particular?
Well, solar and wind definitely, and in conjunction with other, like geothermal in BC, we're on the ring of fire. Harry Swain, the former chair of the environmental assessment board that reviewed this project, after the government decided to issue a certificate for this project and go ahead and build it, he said in an interview that the very fact that this government had not explored geothermal further was a dereliction of duty.
I absolutely feel for the Boone family. That property has been with them for a couple generations, and they've worked hard to bring some very interesting historical buildings from the local area onto their property. But as much as it hurts, these local families in BC will be compensated by BC Hydro, and some of them more than fairly. And when you consider the massive benefits of this project for the entire province, for the affected 120 properties, it is unfortunate, but only 30 of those will actually be affected by flooding or highway realignment. And of those 30, only 10 families are expected to move. Now, if you look into the debate around hydro dams, you will often hear claims that they do, in fact, create emissions. And now this is because of dead organic matter that is left behind during the flooding of the reservoir. Well, I wanted to ask Dave Conway from BC Hydro about that concern directly.
It has emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from the reservoir with methane breakdown. So we're doing a couple of things. We're removing the vast majority of the vegetation, all merchantable timber's coming out. Most non-merchantable is coming out, although we're not going to pull the stumps. So the emissions are going to be low. Information shows that northern hemisphere reservoirs have very low emissions, and those emissions actually are right on line, and in the modeling that we have done shows it's right up there with its emissions based on something like wind, for example. It's right down at the lower end of the scale. But yes, it does have emissions, but they're on the low end of the scale.
Dave is correct to point out that in the northern hemisphere, emissions are significantly lower from hydroelectric reservoirs. This has to do with the vast amounts of vegetation in the region capable of absorbing the additional carbon emissions. In fact, a 2-year study by the University of Quebec at Montreal concluded that hydro dams are indeed emitters of greenhouse gases, though on a much smaller scale than their conventional thermal power plants of similar capacity.
So now we've heard from those opposed. What about those in favor of the project? Well, as I was doing some research into the local partnerships that BC Hydro has struck with local contractors up there, I noticed that many of them were First Nations contractors. So I reached out directly to them in hopes of landing some interviews. However, what I found was many of them were weary of giving such an interview in fear they may be ostracized from their communities over this project. Some also didn't want to jeopardize any other business opportunities they may have in advance of the project starting. Now, some were willing to issue basic written statements saying they were pleased to be partnering on the project, but that was about as far as they were willing to go. And could you blame them? We know how environmental groups love to divide the activist class and the working class on First Nations communities. I mean, Helen Knott said it herself. She believes the awarding of contracts to First Nations contractors is simply an extension of colonialism. I mean, this sort of stuff drives me crazy. Frankly, First Nations communities in the north are the ones who benefit from this economic activity the most, and they desperately need it. I mean, you don't have to look far, really, to see the tentacles of the Tides Foundation reaching the opposition to this project. I can only imagine the payments are similar to those discovered by Financial Post columnist Vivian Krause in her investigation into the funding of oil sands opponents in Canada. But now, besides those directly affected or partnering with the project, were there any locals in the Peace River Valley or Fort St. John who were in support of the project? Well, I have some really good news. In fact, almost everyone I talked to in town gave support for this project. And in fact, one lady in particular had a message for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Let's check it out.
We're not working up here anymore, even the oil patch has gone dead. And I look at it, Trudeau, get off your butt, get the North people up here north of Prince George working. Otherwise, people are going to end up with a bunch of houses here in Fort St. John that ain't going to sell or nothing.
After my trip up north and my research into the impacts and benefits of hydropower, I can now say without a doubt the Site C project will bring immense benefits to the region and the province. But it will also serve as an example of how, with proper planning, BC can once again become an energy-producing superpower as we once hoped we would be 50 years ago under then Premier W.A.C. Bennett. Now, I do hope you've enjoyed this series, but as I'm recording this final segment, it is with a heavy heart for the people of Fort McMurray, Alberta. As you know, they are experiencing horrific wildfires up there right now at this time. And if you do have the time and the means, please visit our website, www.rebuildfortmac.ca, and donate whatever you can. I know I've chipped in $50, and I hope you will do the same. For the Rebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.